Okay, so my first question is I'm curious about the reader response to Deadline over the years since it was published, because it was published in 2007 or 2008, because the topics and the themes in the novel are ones that are of great interest to teens. So can you share some of the comments that you've received from young people about Deadline?
Yeah, I about young people and about older people. It's a real interesting. The first kind of poignant response I got to it. I was at that Allen thing where 85 jillion authors or do their 10-minute thing and sign books, and Deadline had just come out, and I was signing books, and there was a long line. You don't have much time to talk to me, but somebody walked up to me from behind. I felt this hand on my shoulder, and she leaned over and she said, "I was diagnosed with MS 2 days before I read this book. Thank you," and walked away. I didn't even see her face.
Oh.
So there was I got the sense that there was there was that thing I was talking about today. There was this real sense of death is just a trump card of loss, and so you get things back over and over and over again. And the stuff that just rips your heart out of the kids who are facing kind of what Ben's facing. So that's a part of it. The second part is just that sense of grief and that sense of, something happened to me. I wasn't dying. This wasn't death, but it was something that was taken away from me that can never be replaced. So you get a lot of letters like that. I did a Skype thing with a football team whose coach had told them they needed to read Deadline before the first day of practice. So we were doing this Skype, and it was someplace in the Midwest. And the kids came in, and they were getting out of practice. I got them out of practice. They should have been loving me, but they get on Skype and they get a little bit nervous. And this assistant coach came up, and he started talking about these two losses that he'd had over the summer, and they were people who were really close to him. And he had to be like, 290 pounds, great big guy, and he started talking, and he started tearing up. And these kids they were way more interested in his story than they were the book, but it was something that it came out of the book for him. He said, I read that book at exactly the right time. He's probably 30 years old. And then there are the questions that the one that you get from most of the kids that read it that haven't had a situation exactly like this, who just say, it makes me think about my life. Like, what if I were Ben, or what if I were Boomer or Sooner? What would happen if all of a sudden I'm going to get it and I don't know it? And so they say, I get a lot of, it made me look at life differently. Now I know that's a developmental level that's very different from mine. I mean, I'm up there. I can actually get it about Deadline, but they're able to throw it into their imaginations. And the other thing, which is the edgy piece, is this guy who used to be a priest who had molested a kid and is looking for redemption someplace. And boy, there are very few kids who don't know somebody who's been sexually mistreated. And it might not be that. I mean, I gave him a specific, kind of avenue to have that happen. But there are a lot of kids who either have been mistreated or know the kids who have been mistreated. And there's a real that brings some emotion to the top. Because I put him in there because my idea when I put that priest in there, the ex-priest in there, was that not everybody's all bad, not everybody's all good. And if you're a child molester and you go to prison, serial killers are coming after you. So it was, I get that. I get some of that, not too much.
Oh, okay. I'm curious a little bit about, you talked about this specifically with Lies My Teacher Told Me this morning, but throughout Deadline you have been reading and referencing a number of books, you have been seeing and noticing a number of books, and I'm just curious, the ones that come up again and again, Lies My Teacher Told Me, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and some of the other ones, what were their impact on you as a reader, and how did they find their way into the book?
Their impact on me as a reader, Lies My Teacher Told Me, it was perfect. I had written 2 or 3 chapters of Deadline, and this guy said, God, you got to read Lies My Teacher Told Me. And so I got the book, and actually I was listening to it on CD in my car. And I mean, I knew that most history books are pretty much just the patriotic pamphlets. But I started reading things in there that were, oh my God, one of the thing that really got kind of come on point was he's talking about Helen Keller and the fact that she was so angry that everybody talked about the fact that she couldn't talk and she couldn't hear, she couldn't see, and she was a socialist. And she had all of these, really important things. She was a really, really bright lady, and that nobody would ever talk about that. You see all of a sudden you see your teacher teaching her to talk and see and hear, and so then I start, Woodrow Wilson's a white supremacist, and then, I'm going crazy. And I had one of those teachers. I mean, when I was growing up, I was in high school in the early '60s, and the teacher was God, whatever the teacher said, And I had one of those teachers who was real opinionated about politics and things like that. And he was, to his credit, he said so. But then he came in, and said all the things he had to say. And then I started teaching, and I didn't realize, because I was a psych and social major, that if I wanted to be a teacher, I had to be a social studies teacher, because I really knew more about English. And so all of a sudden I was teaching history, and I was teaching in a school in the Tri-Cities in Washington, and it was a team teaching situation. And I had guys that were on my team who were saying things that I knew weren't true. I mean, one of the guys that was teaching with me was talking about how when they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, that they didn't know what it was going to do, and that the guys who in the Enola Gay who dropped the bomb all went crazy. And my dad was a bomber pilot, and I thought, so I called my dad up. I said, "Guys, in Enola Gay, the hell no, they didn't go crazy. They dropped the bomb and they got out of there because they knew exactly what it was going to do." And so that was kind of there was just so much of, we want you to love America and not pay attention to some of the things that have happened in America. And it's that kind of American exceptionalism thing that is, what? And there was Lowen, and he was just, boy, I'll tell you, this guy. And I met him in person afterwards because of the book, and he just was. He was a sociologist and historian, and he was so dedicated to the truth. And so then now I'm going back and say, why can't we tell the truth about ourselves? It's killing me. And then Malcolm X, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X back when he thought it was, along with a couple of Catch-22 and books like that, you thought would make girls think you were cool. And didn't work, but I read the book, and I was there at the time that I read it. There was a real kind of starting to become a split between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. I mean, the guys, the Black Panthers, and all those guys are coming up saying this turning the other cheek is just not working, because they will just come in and take us out. And Malcolm X was starting to make so much sense, and of course, he was part of the Black Muslim thing, which is a separatist group. And then he goes to Mecca, and he's moving toward Mecca, and he looks around, and there's every color there is. And so he comes back, and he wants to readjust things and bring back his message, and he gets killed. And I thought, boy, this guy was a street pimp. Look at the distance he came. And I'm a big fan of Martin Luther King Jr. You can't not be. But boy, there was another side to that. And I was at Eastern Washington State College, which was, up until my last years at Eastern, was lily white. And a racist football coach went to the south side of Chicago and recruited a couple of basketball players and several football players. Brought them up to Eastern, put them in an old rundown hotel or motel down in Cheney, Washington. They lived in the dorms, all this, and treated them very badly. And there was a black student union building in colleges or universities all over the country. And Eastern didn't have enough black students to do that, but the Inland Empire did with college. So they had an Inland Empire Black Student Union, decided that the athletes, when the Star Spangled Banner was played, were going to raise the black fist, the Tommy Smith, John Carlos black fist, which I was a big fan of. And the campus almost flew apart. And I had been, they were going to hire me to come back as a graduate student and coach the swimming team. And then they found out my stance on the black fist, and all of a sudden there was no money to bring me back to coach the swimming team. So that was my one move for civil rights. But it just happened at a time when I was so impressionable, and I I had my grandmother grew up in the South, and you heard all these awful stories about not letting people go to the bathroom, just all the crazy stuff. So I had that built up, and then I read Malcolm X. And then I thought, we do Black History Month, we do all that stuff. Martin Luther King Jr. is all over the place. There are certain, the marches and things like that. Not very many people say anything about Malcolm X. And boy, that guy was, you don't get more courageous than what he was. So, Malcolm X Avenue. In a town that, I grew up, I don't think I saw an African-American human being until I was probably 18 years old, and I heard the N-word every day. And, you didn't even know what it was. And then when you go out and find out what it was, it's really crazy. So, then turn me loose with a novel. So now you know how my ADD works.
So to change tacks a little bit, in the book I was like, what is the illness that he has? Is it mentioned? Because I read it about a year ago, and then we were doing this, and I was trying to comb through my memory. And if you never actually name what illness he has, what's your thought process?
I purposely didn't. I ran the child protection team in Spokane for about 30 years, and there was a pediatrician who's a real specialist in child abuse and neglect. His name was Alan Hendrickson, and we were on the team from the get-go. And anytime I needed medical advice, I'd just say, give me a disease, whatever it was. And so we talked about some forms of leukemia, and at this point I can't even remember which they were, but then I thought, I'm not going to name this because I don't want somebody picking up this book and making this decision, or even thinking they have to make this decision that Ben's having to make. So I'm not going to name it because I'm not going to put, people think I never censor myself, but sometimes I do. In that case I did. I did not want somebody picking up and hearing their own diagnosis. And, any cancer gives you a whole bunch of different, even if it's a dire diagnosis, there's still room. There are miracles. There are things that happen. They go into diseases that go into remission and things like that. And so I thought I'm not saddling anybody with that. So I just didn't. But what I did was I said, I'm on solid ground here, right, Alan? And he said, you're on solid ground.
The other question I have is about the setting, being at this small town, Idaho setting. And to me, it really feels like another character that's in the book with our physical characters. I really like the description of the setting and how the characters had various connections with the town. And specifically, I was thinking about Rudy, who you mentioned just a minute ago, and Coach. And they both had such different reasons for staying in that town.
Yes.
So that was kind of what I wanted to ask is your thoughts on how you set up the town. And
well, the town, it's the town I grew up in. It's Cascade, Idaho. I changed the name because they have a lawyer. One. And actually, I wrote Running Loose in 1983, and I used the same town, Stroud, Idaho. And Louis Banks is the main character in Running Loose, and he's the coach in Deadline. And so I had a line drawn. And one of the things, I went down to Cascade to do the commencement address right around the time that I was starting to write Deadline. It had the same population. There were people I knew there, number one. And it had the same, my graduating class had 15 in it. Theirs had like 18 or 19. So nothing much had changed, although the logging industry had kind of gone into the tank because they forgot to plant trees after they cut them all down. But I look back at that town and I think I came up with some really ugly ideas about race. I came up with some ugly ideas about gender. I lived with loggers, and in my own family, a male voice carried way more weight than a female voice, and you can see that in my mom and my sister. So there's that part of it that I always had an aversion to. The more I started understanding that the real world was a little different than that. But boy, you just know you got taken care of. You don't starve in a town like that. People know your name. You don't sleep out in the. We ate 40 below. It used to get in Cascade. Nobody froze. That just humanity. Their humanity wouldn't let that happen. Let a lot of other things happen, but it wouldn't let that happen. And so there was this thing. Nobody locked their doors. Everybody's car keys were dangling in the car. It was just there was a level of safety, and there was room to run. It's the neighborhood that I grew up in the 4 houses on my block, and then one up. We had at least one kid in every grade from first grade to, we didn't have kindergarten, first grade to, So there was a taking care of that happened that I still have an affinity for. So there's this piece where human beings take care of each other. It's tribal in a sense, because there were never more than 1,000 people in that town. And then there's also this provincialism that just scares you to death because of the philosophical things that people come up with living in those small towns.
So without giving too much away in terms of the subplots, you start off the book with a character with a terminal illness. So as you mentioned this morning, we know how it's going to end. But when we start talking about Sooner and Rudy and some of the minor characters, I think it's fair to say your philosophy on happy endings might be called into question. So what is your philosophy on happy endings, especially in fiction?
My philosophy on happy endings is that it can be as bad as you want it to be, but it has to end on some note of hope. And part of that is my life as a therapist, and part of it's my life as a human being. And when you make mistakes that you think you can't ever get fixed, and you live it long enough to figure out that you don't know the good things from the bad things while they're happening, because some of the worst things that ever happened in you turned out to be your strongest points. So, I look back at the books I've read. Sarah Burns has got a girl who's has been burned. I have a whole bunch of Chinese Handcuffs girl who's been molested, and a boy who watched his brother kill himself. But my job as a therapist, you find out really early that you don't get to save anybody. You know it as teachers, and we don't get to save anybody. But what we can do is join and see if there's a way out. You're kind of looking for the light. And so a story for me ends when you get to that light. And it might be a pretty dim light. Sarah Burns is still burned. Ben's gone. There are all these things. But something comes out of that, that ugliness. And when you're working like most of my early years, all my early years working as a therapist, working with abuse and neglect. So everybody in there, adults that have done things that you just can't, you can never shake the shame of what you've done to your child, or whatever that is. But you still have to manage your life. One of the things, if you're a therapist, you don't want anybody dying. So it's a pretty low bar, but let's see if we can keep everybody alive, right? And then beyond that, is there a step someplace? Is there a handhold? Is there a place you can stick it to elevate a little bit? So you're always looking around for that. And one of the things that you always realize is that the more you know this person, the less you know. And so the more you have to trust this person that you're working with to see what would feel like elevation to you. I need to see the world through your eyes, and to do that, I have to disappear. When I'm writing a story like that, I have to do the same thing because I wanted him to live. I'm sitting there going, sir, no, you can't. That ain't happening. You do that, you'll never write another book. And I want people to feel better. I was born with survivor's guilt, but you're not going to get it. So there is. So my philosophy as a therapist and my philosophy as a writer are really a lot the same. Let's tell this story so it has to be true, and let's see if there's a place, even if it's just one step up, you can get somebody to, so that, and then they're going to go do what they do. You can't be married to the result, because a lot of times you're not going to get it. And as a writer, you get to, you're God, and when you wrote the book, you create the characters, and you can make it happen the way you want. But it has to be believable.
So you are God. You created this book.
Every time I write a book, mess with me, I will give you warts.
So because we're teachers and we don't want warts, what is the thing that you would want the students to come away with? What would you want teachers to emphasize if you were teaching it as a class?
I really love the idea, the kind of pure idea of reader response. The idea that any book I write will be better than it ever had a right to be because of the history the reader brings. And the one thing that I think we get to do as educators is we get to level the playing field with a story. I can sit down with somebody who loves To Kill a Mockingbird today, and I read it, a year after it came out. And so, it's classic now, and it was modern fiction then. But Scout is Scout to anybody who picks that book. And it might be a very, very different Scout to a kid that would pick that book up and read it today than it was to me. But the intimacy, her willingness to tell it all. I'm pretty sure Harper Lee felt that intimacy with Scout so that we could feel that intimacy with Scout. So what I try to do, and what I would like to have happen with my books, is that anything that a kid comes away with is the thing I want them to come away with. If they hate it, I want them to just hate the hell out of it. You know, I mean, just go ahead and jump up and say it. And I've had that happen, and I'm lucky. It doesn't happen too often, mostly because kids who hate books don't write letters. There's some shred of decency even in mean kids, right? But I love the idea that a book can mean something different to the kid than it meant to me, and it's every bit as real and every bit as viable as what I meant. It doesn't matter. The minute that book is finished, the minute the publisher puts it out, it doesn't belong to me anymore. When kids will ask all the time, "What happened next?" and I say, "Man, I don't know. What do you think? Because your guess is probably better than mine." Because I stopped thinking about it. I wrote that book like 50 times. I revised that thing. I was getting ready to give Sarah Burns one leg. You know? So I really love the idea, because what it does is it spurs creativity. And boy, that's what we either have that or we don't have any. I mean, if we don't have that, who wants to teach? If we can't get into imagination, what's the fun of it? You know, I can't see my life doing flashcards. So, you know, I'm real appreciative of whatever kids come out with.
Thanks for sitting down with us.
Oh, thank you.